Hey everybody, welcome to Landscape Rescue. On this episode, I'm at the Lowe's in Springfield, Missouri, one of the two, and I'm going to take a look and see if we can find some clearance. It is a very cold and gloomy day, but before we go to the clearance, I just kind of wanted to walk around and see if there's anything fun to talk about. It took me about 15 seconds. I found these weeping serpentine blue Atlas cedar. So Deciduous, Atlantica, Glauca, Pendula. Sometimes this can get a little confusing for folks, but this is a serpentine. It's been trained to be a serpentine. Okay, so they took a weeping blue Atlas cedar when it was young and impressionable. They stuck a stake in the middle and then they just kept tying it to the stake, right? So that's kind of how they do that to make them serpentine. You can do serpentine, you can make anything a serpentine. Just works really well with weeping stuff, like a weeping cherry. A market for the serpentine weeping cherries. Looking at this particular blue Atlas cedar, if I just give it a little hop, so it's gonna come to about mid-shoulder, so I would say, or not mid-shoulder, mid-arm, right by my bicep, in the ground once it's planted. A lot of folks just leave it, right? So they just leave it, and it's only gonna get that tall. But the plant itself is going to want to maintain more market share. So then it's going to start shooting out this way, or it's going to start shooting out that way. And it's just going to get a little unruly, and they eventually end up looking like Cousin It. So I have gone to customers' houses, and one of the first things when I see one of these, one of the first things I have to do, I'm going to start thin some of these branches out. And when we're talking about an overgrown one, I've got branches that big around that might shoot out 5 or 6 feet. A lot of people will take it out, but if I can talk them out of it, I won't take it out, I'll trim it up and I'll bring back that shape, because the shape's there, they just can't see it because they've been intimidated by taking foliage away from the plant, right? So a little maintenance goes into these, a little due diligence, I guess, coming in and kind of thinning it out to where you can actually see the characteristic of the serpentine that made you fall in love with it in the first place. There's a reason people buy a serpentine blue Atlas cedar, because they like how it looks. It's unique. You don't see them that often. Unfortunately, the tree is a business, and it's going to put out needles and branches to take advantage of the market share. That market share is sunlight, and it uses sunlight to produce simple sugar, carbohydrates, to pay its employees. And its employees are beneficial fungus, for sure. One of its top employees is beneficial fungus. And then you also have beneficial bacteria that can benefit from that. Stay on top of them, keep them thin, get some dedicated branches. Don't let those branches do whatever in the heck they want, because you don't let your teenagers do whatever they want. Don't let your blue Atlas cedar do whatever it wants. Especially a specimen like this, you can play around and you can do something really cool. I mean, it's already really cool. Just keep it cool. All right, so that's the weeping blue Atlas cedar. Another thing I wanted to say is I was here earlier and this had completely defoliated. It was brown, and then you can see now that it's starting to push new needles. I have seen blue Atlas cedars come back from a really hard winter. I've seen hollies come back from a really hard winter. Green giants come back from a really hard winter. But you know what I've never seen come back from a really hard winter? Emerald arborvitae. I have never seen a brown emerald arborvitae come back. It's almost like when they give up, they want to just go to the rainbow bridge. There's no convincing them that it's not their time to walk towards the light. I think we should also talk about his buddy over here, the weeping Norway spruce. This particular weeping Norway spruce and the serpentine are both what we would call field potted. And let me show you what that means. Field potted can mean one of two things. It's either ball and burlapped, which is what we're looking at now. It's usually done with like emerald arborvitaes. I see a lot of that. I see a lot of, just like mass produced plants. They'll do this a lot. They'll have a piece of equipment, goes down, penetrates, squeezes, and then puts it right into a pot. You're still leaving the roots in the field. About 5 to 10% of the roots that were sustaining that tree are actually coming with it. The attrition rate is going to be higher on ball and burlap stuff, field potted stuff. Now in this particular situation, what they did is they dug the trees, ball and burlapped them, and then they put them in a pot with a soil medium. So people like Lowe's and people like Home Depot and even some other nurseries, including the nursery I used to work at, we can put these out on a pad, right? Because there's going to be some water retention ability with that medium there. And then as they grow out, they're not growing into the gravel on your pad. They're not sitting there just baking in the sun, right? Which is real hard on a ball and burlap tree. That's why we usually have them in a tree row covered with pole chips or something like that, just to keep that radiant heat from evaporating out of that root ball. So what they did here is they just put the B&B ball and burlap into a pot, covered it with soil medium, so that way, something well drained, that way they can keep that radiant heat off of the root ball. Not only that, but they can set it out anywhere they want to go. It's just like a potted plant at that point. They do have a tendency to shift sometimes in the wind because you just have a little ball in there. It's really not a concern is when it shifts. The only concern you have is when it shifts and nobody goes and straightens it back up, and then you get a little hook. It happens a lot with evergreens. You'll get a little hook right up there at the top. It's very hard to sell it at that point because it just looks goofy. I mean, not in the case of this weeping Norway spruce. The weeping Norway spruce looks goofy. It's a Dr. Seuss looking tree by design. It's a kooky guy, but I love them, right? I was at a botanical garden, and I can't remember if it was in St. Louis or, anyway, I've been to a lot of botanical gardens, but they had a weeping Norway spruce that just kind of meandered over the pathway, and you kind of walked underneath of it, and all of its needles were just kind of hanging, and it was very pretty. It was almost welcoming you into the next area. Weeping Norways, like the weeping blue atlas cedar, are going to take advantage of market share, so a lot of times they get really thick. The saving grace for the weeping Norway is if you plant it in a berm amongst other stuff, right, amongst perennials and flowering shrubs. These will do well if you can thin out the blue atlas cedar. So you'd want to thin it out so you get to see some of its cool characteristics, especially on a serpentine. And then on the weeping Norway, they're really cool. They're almost like a good companion for like a Ryusen Japanese maple, because they kind of do that whole, cousin it looking. And they're very pretty in the fall, especially with this dark green backdrop. Look at how pretty that green is. It's very dark and unique. Now this is getting ready to candle. That's what you see here. You see these little candles. And the only reason I know that this blue atlas cedar had defoliated is because I saw it earlier, a couple weeks ago. I'm a huge fan. So weeping Norways, they got the weeping Norway for $117. And I would say it's probably a field potted 10 gallon, 18 feet high, which I would say that's probably fair because they will do their thing, right? So they will kind of meander. So that's a weeping Norway. I'm a fan. I like the weeping Norways. The next plant that I thought was worth a talk about was this apricot drift rose. Now, I'm a huge fan of apricot colored anything. If you can give me a combination of orange and pink, I'm gonna be a fan. It just kind of is what it is. But the apricot drift is like a knockout that doesn't get out of control. I feel like if you don't control knockout roses with some good pruning practices, and when I say good pruning practices, just a schedule where you're pruning. I will prune a knockout rose, almost round it off, or I say roll them. I'm gonna roll them, or when you go to that property, just roll the roses when you're there mowing. That's how you can talk to some guys. And I like to do that in maybe 3 or 4 times during the season, just to get them to flush all at once and give you a real big pop of color. The drift roses will do the exact same thing. I've got a story where my boss said, hey, would you go trim the roses when you guys are at my house today? And I'm like, absolutely. Actually, we were doing some work for his neighbor, and he goes, while you're over there, can you trim my roses? Well, I went, and basically from later on, I hear the story that his wife said that I butchered the roses, and she was very upset with me. 2 weeks later, when they started pushing buds and they exploded with color, gained a fan for life, because they had never done that before. And this was a landscape owner's wife. And then I showed her just that one thing. Obviously, I fed them afterwards. I used a water-soluble 2799, which was actually for trees, but I really like to use it for shrubs. And I just watered it. I also like to use an 11-22-22 for trees. This is all from Plant Healthcare, PHC. But anyway, the 11 is 100% slow release nitrogen. I used that 2799 on there, and then 2 weeks later, it was pushing blooms and it was just a carpet. Don't worry about rolling a drift rose. Don't be worried about rolling a knockouts. I feel like sometimes drifts respond a little bit better to it. We used to do it at the nursery periodically when we had time. We would just roll half of our knockout roses, get them to reflush, and then the new ones that came in, they were flushing. And then so by the time the new ones were kind of spent, then the ones we had rolled are rolling in, you know, they're coming up, right? And we'd start selling them. So we got ourselves on this 2-week schedule where we were trimming things. No one buys them because they're all trimmed up, and then 2 weeks later they look amazing, which is contradictory to the business model. The business model obviously is sell it as soon as possible. Don't put any extra labor into it other than pulling it off the truck and organizing it. You know, when they're not selling, you got to do what you can to sell them. Drift roses, same way. We would trim them pretty hard. 2 or 3 weeks later, we would sell them because they would reflush. So don't be afraid to do that. I like to feed them when I do that. At that particular nursery I worked at, I used the biosolid and I would just toss it in the pot, you know, a handful of biosolid in the pot, and it would keep the deer out of it, because the deer really like these young rosebuds. And you can tell deer damage because it looks like somebody with buck teeth went through and grabbed it, right? So if you look at the wound, you can tell, oh, that's deer. Deer are showing up to my house at 2:30 in the morning. That is the drift rose, and there's about 1,000 varieties of drift. I feel like there's tons of drifts out there, and I have to admit, I like all of them. I like their utility. Now these will have thorns. Drift roses have thorns. They'll only get about 3 by 3, and you can keep them pretty tight. When they throw up the big shoots and it has like 30 blooms on it, a lot of the times if we're dealing with a little bit more conservative landscape, I will cut those and let it reflush in a different way. But that's the drift rose. Pretty big fan of the drift rose. These are a 2-gallon for $24.98. Okay, here's something fun that I think you guys might enjoy, because we don't get to see these very often. But this is, well, at least in my neck of the woods, this is kind of an untapped resource, and this is the deciduous azalea. So not something we see very often around here, and once they're done blooming, vendors typically don't carry them anymore after that. Privately owned garden centers, it kind of depends on the person that's ordering the plants, if they'll order more of these after the bloom time's done. But look how well they're blooming. They're blooming really good. This one is Rosy Lights. This one here is, I like them both equally. I like white deciduous azaleas. I do not like white evergreen azaleas, and the reason is because when these petals start to fade and they start to drop off, a lot of times they'll just sit on the foliage and then start decomposing on the foliage, and it just kind of gives it a messy look. White plants, it depends on the plant. Does that make sense? So the deciduous azalea, when it starts dropping its petals, there's not a whole lot of foliage for it to get caught on, where an evergreen azalea has got all that foliage there. And they're both very, very pretty. Like I say, I don't have anything against azaleas. In my area, we just have a hard time getting them to stick. That's the main issue for me. A little difference between the two. The deciduous azalea, you can put in a lot more sun typically than you can in my neck of the woods, than you can an evergreen azalea. You can kind of see back here, there's plenty of evergreen azaleas. Here's one that you see, a deciduous azalea you see quite often, is the northern highlights, and all of these are $28.98. See, like this one, this is an evergreen azalea. This is Gerard's Rose. It has been around a long time, and I'm a big fan of that one because it's a pretty consistent performer. Some of the ever blooming azaleas, the ones that bloom on old growth and new growth, they don't give you that big stereotypical azalea show that people are looking for. Kind of one of the running gags that I have is that men rarely ever chime in about what they want with the landscaping. They just let their wife handle it, unless they're golfers. And if they're golfers, they always want azaleas. I've noticed that. They don't say anything until they figure out we haven't put any azaleas in, and then they start talking about azaleas. Man, I really appreciate you coming along with me. This was kind of fun. I'm enjoying it. It was a crappy day. I walked out of the house thinking I was good. I was completely unprepared for how cold and windy it was, and I was thinking about going home and maybe just doing it some other time, you know, shooting another video some other time. But man, I'm super glad I came. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's Stuart Moore. This is Landscape Rescue, and thank you very much for letting me into your home to talk about plants.